Hello, and welcome to Elantum Digital's Publishing by the Numbers, where we help authors and self-publishers create quality books and build successful self-publishing businesses.
Hi guys, welcome to the podcast. You are here with Publishing by the Numbers. Why do I keep calling it Self-Publishing by the Numbers? I don't know. Anyway, it's Publishing by the Numbers. It is week 4. This is podcast number 4. We are calling this the Halloween special featuring horror and mystery author Dane Cobain. So we have a wonderful interview, which is really going to be more of a discussion about all things spooky, creepy, and that go bump in the night, which we'll get to here in just a minute. Let me first introduce my fabulous co-host, CJ and I. Hi, CJ.
Hello.
Virginia isn't with us today. We talked about doing this, and she says, yes, all of that horror stuff scares me, so you can go ahead and do this show without me, which makes us sad, but at the same time, we're going to still have a good time, and then you guys can tell her how much of a good time we had and that she was very missed. We will also be looking for updates on what she has done with her tennis outfit and whether or not actual tennis is being played or she's just wearing the outfit around the house, which could totally be a thing, knowing Virginia. So, you know, what you gonna do? So for this week, because we're releasing the day before Halloween, and that's kind of a fun, scary, spooky time of year, we wanted to talk about horror as a genre, talk about some of our favorite Halloween. We're going to make it more broad media because a lot of Halloween is movies and that kind of thing as much as it is books. But we wanted to kind of talk about, some of our favorites there, and also talk just a little bit about releasing during the holidays, writing books that appeal to a certain holiday, and kind of how things work with that, whether that's a good idea, a bad idea, all of those kinds of things. So to bring Dane into our conversation so that he doesn't just have to listen to CJ and I go back and forth, as pleasant as that is. Folks, this is Dane Cobain. He is a published author, freelance writer, and occasional poet and musician with a passion for languages and learning. When he's not working on his next release, he can be found reading and reviewing books while trying not to be distracted by Wikipedia. I can see why you would be distracted by Wikipedia. That is the most lovely rabbit hole. His releases include No Rest for the Wicked, a supernatural thriller, Eyes Like Lighthouses, and When the Boats... Is that all one?
It's all one word. It's a long phrase, yeah.
I can do that. Eyes Like Lighthouses, When the Boats Come Home, which is poetry, Former.ly, literary fiction, Social Paranoia, which is nonfiction, Come On Up to the House, which is horror, Subject Verb Object, anthology, Driven, crime detective, The Tower Hill Terror, more crime detective, Meat, horror. I've seen the cover for Meat. That's a good horror cover. Wow. Scarlet Sin, short stories, the Lexicologist's Handbook, nonfiction, and is it the Lepfold?
Lightfold Files,
yeah. The Lightfold Files.
There's a story there, yeah. So
okay, why don't you start with that story? What are the Lightfold Files?
Well, so James Lightfold is my cozy mystery detective, and as part of that, it's my throwback to Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes and all of that stuff. So it's very much in the sort of traditional cozy mystery style, but with a modern technological twist to it. But as part of that, I've sort of deliberately given people names that are very difficult to say or that look weird. So that his assistant's called Miley, but it's spelled Maile. And there's a cop. Nice. There's a cop in it as well called Jack Chumley, and that's an old English surname. So it's spelled. It looks as though it should be pronounced Cholmondeley, but it's just because we're British, we say Chumley. And we have loads of great great things like that. There's in Oxford near me. There's Magdalen College, but it's spelled like Magdalene, like Mary Magdalene. And and I've learned this the hard way. If you say to somebody from Oxford, like Magdalen College, they'll give you a really weird look because that's not how it's pronounced, but it looks like it should be. So I've kind of been inspired by that a bit and given loads of my characters these weird names that nobody can pronounce, as demonstrated when you try and pronounce the title of the Lightfold Files. It does also mean it gets very interesting when they get turned into audiobooks because I have to give very comprehensive notes to the narrator, being like, "This is how you say this name. This is how you say this name." Because it's all in my head. I know how they should all sound, and then it just sounds weird to me if someone says it wrong.
So did you go for a British narrator so it would be the same kind of pronunciation as you hear in your own head?
Yeah. So he was a British one. It was all done through Findaway Voices, which you guys are familiar with, and that's actually through a small publisher. So it was weird because then they were like acting as the go-between, and I was like, well, I could just do it myself for you guys, but yeah, no, we found a pretty good guy who had the right kind of voice for it in the end. So.
Well, we were talking to Dane a little bit earlier and explaining why we wanted to have him on the show. And first of all, it's because Dane is awesome. And with the British accent, he brings something that elevates the entire show. But also because when CJ and I started talking about Halloween and about horror and that kind of thing, we determined very, very quickly that we are not horror people in the really scary, gory sense of the word. My very favorite Halloween movie is The Mummy with Brendan Fraser, which is comedy horror. It's kind of comedy paranormal even. It's not particularly horrific at all. And I love it. It is near and dear to my heart. I will watch that every single year. And I will watch Disney's Halloween special every single year with my daughter. And, things like that. I don't like to be creeped out, and I don't like serial killers. And so I'm not a great representative for that. I'm a great representative for the fun, lightly spooky side of Halloween and horror media, but not on the other side. And we found out that CJ is much the same. And because of that, we thought we'd better bring in somebody to balance it out, or else she will think that we don't know our genres, and we do. We just get scared easily. So that's kind of where we wanted to start. So I have just said, my very favorite movie, and we're going to talk a little bit about different kinds of media as we're talking about this. So my favorite movie is The Mummy. CJ, what is your favorite movie, television show, Halloween thing?
I adore Peanuts Halloween, obviously. Charlie Brown, Linus.
I Gotta Rock.
I Gotta Rock. It's got some great one-liners in there. One of my, the most favorite thing that we always say, my mom and I always say, is serenity as far as the eye can see, because that's what he says in the pumpkin patch. I also love The Ghost and Mr. Chicken. And that is a fun oldie with now I'm just I always blank on names when I get on this podcast. I need to start writing things down. Is it Don Knotts?
Don Knotts.
Uh-huh. Yeah. Man, that guy is so funny, but he plays an incredibly wonderful, hysterical coward going to stay a night in an old haunted house that also is a murder house, and it's the funniest, sweet show. So it's not scary at all, but those are my two go-tos every year. I love those two movies. So that's where I'm at. Very playful, very fun, very lighthearted, and it doesn't keep me up at night. And that's really important to me. So,
and I do have to admit, I will do old school Vincent Price, because the man had horror in just the right way. The Pit and the Pendulum and some of those. And you got to play Thriller and listen to him in the background. He and Michael Jackson. But that's about where we go. So Dane, help us, Obi-Wan Kenobi. Actually, that's totally for the science fiction and fantasy podcast. We'll do that later. So what are we missing out on that we are not bringing to the people?
Well, what I will say first is that The Mummy is actually an excellent movie as well. It's kind of a family favorite between me and my mum, because here in the UK, it's always on TV as well. It's just like every day it's on some channel somewhere. And then I quite like Hocus Pocus as well. It's not a scary one, but it is fun. But yeah, kind of, it's funny you mentioning things like serial killers and whatnot, and I think maybe this is kind of coming back to the the cozy mysteries. So I really like true crime kind of stuff, so I watch a lot of that. My girlfriend and I we watch a lot of BuzzFeed Unsolved, because they go to haunted houses and they try and communicate with the dead and stuff. But this is the thing, is we watch those just before bed, because they're entertaining, right? So rather than being sort of outright scared by them, probably in terms of it's a difficult one to choose from, because when I'm thinking horror, there are so many different genres within horror. So The Exorcist for me is probably the scariest one. That just freaks me out so much. But then probably my favorite in terms of the one I've watched the most is probably something like 28 Days Later, which is zombie apocalypse. And it's got Cillian Murphy in it, who is the guy who's in Peaky Blinders as well. So he's just a great actor. But I love the zombies in that because they're crazy. So like in other zombie films, you've got like your normal zombies, like sort of shambling, slow walking things. In 28 Days Later, they absolutely leg it at you. So you've got no chance. These aren't like slow zombies. These things will jump out of a cupboard at you and chase you down the street, and they'll probably outrun you as well. And also the zombie virus in that, like it takes hold really, really quickly, so you can almost see it happening, which I think is like fascinating as well, because then you get like, once you get towards bits where there's like a mass brawl between people or whatever, if someone gets bit, they're going to be transformed into a zombie within 30 seconds. So suddenly they become an enemy the second they get bit and all of this stuff. And I quite like that kind of stuff. I quite like kind of more psychological horror as well. But really, with horror, most horror I'm okay with. What actually gets me, and it annoys me that it gets me, is jump scares. So anything with a jump scare, I legitimately jump and get really scared, and then I get annoyed by it. Whereas anything else, I'm kind of all right with. So we watched. There's a new version of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and we watched that recently. And just throughout the entirety of it, I think I was annoying my girlfriend just by constantly making jokes about it and like pointing at things or like predicting what's about to happen. It's like somebody's going down some stairs, and I'm like, well, they're not going to last very long. And then no surprises, they don't. And so like quite often things like that, like I almost kind of laugh at it. That makes me sound crazier than I am. I'm not that crazy, but I don't know. I find those kind of things quite funny. So it's normally the jump scares that get me, and then sometimes like body horror. That's probably the thing that creeps me out the most. So yeah, but anything horror really, and anything true crime, serial killers, great.
Yeah, there's a commercial here in the States that is a riff on that, where it's got the little teenagers and they're running around and they go, why not get in the running car? Because they're being chased by a serial killer. And they go, are you crazy? No, let's go hide in the cemetery. And the whole point of it is that, because you're in a horror movie, that's what you do, whether it makes sense or not. And then they're selling car insurance because it's the right thing to do. Just like in a horror movie, you go and you hide behind things, and they've got the serial killer who's just watching the teenagers like, no, you are so dumb. And that is actually one of our favorite commercials, because it's like, yep, that's what you do in a horror movie.
Yeah. So and we talk a lot about that kind of stuff. I mean, those are the tropes of the genre. That you even have like the final girls. So like in Scream, for example, that kind of almost catapulted final girls into just being a staple of any horror movie. And I don't know, I find it interesting to see, like, because then that gets parodied in things like if you've ever seen Scary Movie, which isn't a scary movie, but it parodies scary movies. It's quite clever the way it's done. But yeah, it's interesting to see the things like that crop up all of the time, and especially in like US sort of high school like horror movies. It's always like anybody who's getting frisky, they're gonna die. Like that's just how it works. They go up to the bedroom by themselves, and the killer comes like bursts in on them. So it's always, but that's how you can then kind of predict when you're watching something. You're like, well, it's not going to end well for this person because so and so, and it never ends up well for people who do that.
Though some of that, I think, goes back to kind of our roots of horror, which happened with a lot of folk tales. And a lot of those folk tales were stories where you were saying, be good or else.
Yeah.
It's a big, cold, scary world out there. And if you wander in the woods by yourself, the wolf is going to eat you. I mean, really, Little Red Riding Hood is a quintessential horror story, because it's all about, if you go through the woods and you break the rules, bad things are going to happen. And she goes through the woods and she breaks the rules. And in the classic versions of it, Grandma gets eaten. She nearly gets destroyed. Somebody else finally shows up to save them. But all these bad things happen. And I think that's kind of the root of a lot of our modern horror, and why those same tropes come up, because it's still the don't go off alone, don't be having underage sex, don't get drunk, don't do all the things we tell our teenagers don't do are the things that they do in horror movies, and then the slasher slashes them, and there's always a punishment for the crime of misbehaving. So
I never made that connection. I just thought it was part of the story beats for horror, and that there were different levels of intensity for it. And now you got me thinking, Jenna, all the way back to folktales. Although Brothers Grimm is a really good example of Because Brothers Grimm fairy tales were nothing like what I was told they were.
Mhm.
Because they're a lot more gruesome if you don't edit them or make them, child friendly, really. So that's
Yeah. Well, wasn't it? I think the one that I always think of. So it was in Cinderella, didn't I think in the original of that, the ugly sisters cut off their toes to try and fit into the slipper.
Yep.
And it's like that's that again. That's body horror. That's just classic body horror.
Yeah,
And
they
it's
cut off their
horrible.
toes and they cut off their heels in order to fit in the slipper. And the slipper is full of blood when it gets tried on Cinderella. And then they try to follow her when she goes off with the prince, and her little bird friends peck their eyes out and they're blind. We have just horrified CJ. Yay!
Oh my
Podcast
God.
accomplished.
Yeah, no, I'm sitting here going, this is all news to me. And I even looked at some of the Brothers Grimm stories. Of course, I stopped after like 2 because I was like, no, not in my horror world, not in my beautiful, safe horror world.
I like how
that's terrifying.
I like how you invited me on, thinking, yeah, we're going to talk about all these terrifying horror things, and we've got to Cinderella, and you just totally creeped out by it.
I'm like freaked out now.
Oh yeah, it gets worse. So many of our classic fairy tales and folk tales, when you get to their actual origins, they were the stories that you told around the campfire at night in order to keep people behaving, because they lived in a really, really scary world. And I think a lot of that turned into our modern horror, where it is what is scary in the modern world. And so a lot of monsters and that kind of thing are built out of what do we fear. And I read a whole treatise on zombies, that the thing with zombies is that they don't hate you. They don't dislike you. They don't feel anything about you. It's not personal. They just keep coming. And there is nothing you can do to stop them. Mm-hmm. And then they said, look at the world around you. Zombies always become a really big thing when the world feels really out of control. And it's out of control in this big way where you can't deal with it one-on-one, and it just keeps coming. Mm-hmm. And so I do like the understanding the background of horror. I just can't watch it because it creeps me out. So there's some cool things in there. So since we've kind of crossed into now talking about book horror, Dane, tell us a little bit about your horror stories. What flavor of horror do you write? Why do you like it? What brought you into writing on the darker side of the genre?
Well, it's funny. So my first published book was No Rest for the Wicked, which it's a novella really, but that's a supernatural thriller, and that's about it's about angels, except they're basically evil. Nice. It's funny. It's funny. I think a lot of what I do with horror is like I sort of subvert it a little bit like that. So the idea behind these angels is that they're beings, they're made entirely out of light, and they're kind of passing judgment on people. But the problem is they're judging people based on whether they've sinned or not. And obviously everybody has sinned. We've all told a lie at some point, if nothing else, So they just judge everybody as being a sinner. And so they're sort of slowly working their way around, just pretty much incinerating people, because again, they're made entirely out of light. So if they touch you, you go up in flames. Nice. And it follows the attempt to try and stop them from kind of wiping out humanity, essentially. And that came from a nightmare, which a lot of my horror does. It starts out as nightmares, and I'm like, that was terrifying. I'm going to write about that. Pretty much the same thing happened with Come On Up to the House, which that one, funnily enough, I first wrote it when I was at university, and I was studying screenwriting. So I was like, I want to write a full-length screenplay. And so that's essentially what it started out as. It was a screenplay for a horror movie, and then what would you call it? I did like a novelization of my own screenplay, essentially, and then kind of bundled those two together. And that's very much like a classic haunted house story. But again, with like a lot of my stuff, it's like a modern twist. It reminds me of, I read the Stepford Wives. No, not the Stepford Wives. I read Rosemary's Baby recently. Oh,
right.
I'm getting confused because I read the Stepford Wives as well, and I watched the movie of that the other day. So I read Rosemary's Baby, and in the introduction to that, it was talking about how Ira Levin, when he wrote it, he was looking at things like Frankenstein and Dracula, and they very much felt like a world away from like the New York brownstones that he was used to. So he wanted to write something that was a horror thing that was set in a like recognizably, contemporary world to him, which kind of happens a lot more in horror now. But yeah, that's what I kind of did with Coming Up to the House. So it's pretty much set in like just a sort of suburban contemporary British house, and even like the ghost in it, he's like a heavy metal kid. He's really into the Norwegian. He's into the Norwegian death metal bands that were part of like the church burning craze. So for a while, these metal bands, they were doing all this like satanic music and stuff, and a bunch of crazy heavy metal people started burning down churches. Basically, it's really interesting. If you look up the band Mayhem, they're probably the best one to look at because every member in that was crazy. One of them went to jail for stabbing another one. Like it's just all of this crazy stuff. And actually, this guy who went to jail, he's released an album that he recorded while he was in jail, and it's all only done on like synthesizers and a keyboard because he wasn't allowed any stringed instruments because the strings could be used as weapons or to harm people with. It's crazy all of this stuff that went on. But yeah, so that all kind of got inspired out of that because I've just been reading about these bands and I was like, this is nuts. Like I need to write about this in some way. And then Meat is my like most recent one, and it's probably the book I'm the most proud of. And that one came about because it's quite inspired by Stephen King, because I suppose my earlier horror, I'd read a bit of Stephen King, but he wasn't a particular favorite, and he's kind of gone on to become one. So I wanted to try and write something longer, but also something I'd noticed that Stephen King and a lot of other horror writers in general do is they take stuff that people are already scared of or already find unpleasant, and then they build a horror around that. So like It, for example, people were already afraid of clowns, and then It just made people even more afraid of clowns. And even things like Bird Box by Josh Malerman. That's the one where like people have to cover their eyes, and I was like, well, people actually, it's quite creepy having to cover your eyes. Like people don't like having their eyes like covered. People like to be able to see, So and that's the same with like A Quiet Place as well. They did the same thing, but with having to keep total quiet, and it's So me, I was thinking like, what's the most horrible place I can think of, and I came up with a factory farm. And so at the time I was vegetarian, and I did all this research, and I've read so many books about factory farming. I've watched like a lot of undercover footage and all of this stuff, and that's why I then became vegan, because after reading all of that and watching all of that, I was like, geez, this is like, yeah, it would happen to anybody if you watched and read that much stuff, because I've read like a lot of books about it. And but yeah, so then that enabled me to like, I did what Margaret Atwood did with The Handmaid's Tale. So she's been criticized by some people who've said like, oh, The Handmaid's Tale could never happen. And her argument is, well, everything that happens in this book has happened somewhere in our world at some point. They might have all happened in different cultures. And that's kind of what happened with Meat. So it's like, well, all of these horrible things that are going on, they all happened in different countries or as a different part of meat production or whatever. And then I kind of threw zombie animals into the mix as well. But also there is like body horror in it. So like a guy gets his hand caught in like a chicken grinder.
Yep, I'm done.
Yeah. That's one of my favorite parts. That when I wrote that scene, I was like, this is horrible. Like I even finished writing it, and I sort of sat back and was like, wow, am I a bad person for writing this? But it was also a lot of fun as well. So yeah, those are my main horror ones really. And it kind of, as you listed at the start, like I write a bit of everything, so I read a bit of everything. But horror is always, it's kind of like my first love, and I go back to it a lot.
And also, you got me. I was doing fine until you got to the chicken grinder, and
now my super nachos, my super nachos are not looking the same as they did before.
You start feeling that creepy on the back of your neck now that you're thinking about it. And
funny enough, the last line of the blurb on it is just bon appetit as well. Because
nice blurb.
Dane, nice touch. That's awesome.
That works out beautifully. So you mentioned Stephen King, who kind of seems to be, the granddaddy of the field. Are there other favorites that you would recommend that write kind of this classic style, little bit darker horror?
I suppose, there are a ton to choose from, really. Like, even mentioning Ira Levin earlier, so some of his are more like thrillers and some of them are more kind of horror. But his are interesting because they are that more like sort of psychological horror. Like especially like Rosemary's Baby and The Stepford Wives. In both of those, pretty much the main character thinks she's going crazy, and it turns out she's not going crazy. She's just in this really messed up situation. So I think that's interesting because they kind of do horror without gore. that's horror that like my grandma could read, you know. And then like in terms of like, so Stephen King, as you say, is the daddy. Although he's funnily enough, he cites Ira Levin as being one of his influences, and I can see that because King started out doing this really hardcore horror, and then more recently, it's like he's done some police thrillers recently. I'm currently reading his newest book, which is called Fairy Tale, which is just ties everything around in a beautiful little circle. Nice. It's not really horror. It's kind of like, it's almost like portal fantasy, I guess. So he's kind of changed from back in the day when it was just pure horror. The other one is like James Herbert. His stuff's great. His Rats trilogy. Yeah, it is a trilogy. That one's a really interesting one because the 3 books, they're so different. They're all set in the same universe, and like they kind of follow each other chronologically. But by the 3rd one, it's kind of like post-apocalyptic after like nuclear war thing going on. So it's really weird how that series progresses. Like I couldn't predict the way that was going. But he's really good at doing like gore as well, which I do like a bit of gore, especially in fiction. Joe Hill is a must read. He's Stephen King's son, and he basically just is like a chip off his father's block. There's a scene in his book Heart-Shaped Box, which, don't worry, this isn't going to creep you out too much, but the way it was written, there's this ghost in it. This ghost is in it, and he's talking about how the guy's like eyes are like crossed out, and like they're seeing this ghost with his eyes crossed out, and just the way that was written, that really freaked me out.
Nice.
And I can't really explain why. And then you got the classics like Dracula and Frankenstein, both very much worth reading. They're kind of like the forerunners of the genre. Frankenstein's often credited as kind of kickstarting sci-fi as well. And then Dracula, that creeped me out because I read about half of Dracula staying over at someone's house. And I'd never been there before. And like I was like in their living room, but it was like this open plan ground floor. So they got these like bay window doors. So
nice.
And it was like, and I'm just like there, like cuddled up against this sofa, being like, I can't actually see the end of the house down here. I can just see these windows going into the darkness. And it was, I didn't get much sleep that night, but I did read a lot of Dracula. So yeah, there was that. And then also in terms of books, but the movie as well, The Exorcist, William Peter Blatty. That book terrified me. That's because normally with books, I don't actually get too scared. Like I can quite happily read horror and not get particularly scared. Like I get more scared from watching movies, I think. But The Exorcist is one of those books that really creep me out. I think in Friends, I think that's the book that Joey keeps in the freezer because he's really scared of it.
It might be The Shining.
Oh no, it is. It's The Shining.
I think it's right, The Shining that he puts it in the freezer because that's what you do when a book either makes you sad or creeps you out, as the book has to go in the freezer.
Yeah, you're right. The Exorcist is the one. There's this story that I've heard from this guy who works in advertising, and basically somebody he was working with was really scared of The Exorcist, like because he got the cover and everything. He was super scared of this book, so he took it away and he threw it out into the sea. And so this guy went and bought a new copy of the book, the exact same cover, ran it under a tap, and then left it inside his drawer at the office for him to find. And that's just a great story.
Oh. Can you imagine?
It's one of those where I'm like, I'm sure that can't be real. And I've heard about 4 different versions of that story from different people, but I'm like, that's a good story. It doesn't matter if it's real or not, you know.
Urban legends are fantastic that way. Well, and I will come with you with the classics. So I do like Dracula. I love Frankenstein. Edgar Allan Poe is my jam. I like most of those. He's got a couple that didn't work for me, but the vast majority of them, I will read those to death. I really enjoy those. I remember when I was a kid having somebody read The Telltale Heart to me.
Yeah.
And that was not so good when I was about 9, because that was the same thing where I'm like, here we are. And it was at my grandmother's house that had all wooden floors. So you're sitting there on the bed and going, and he put him in the floor. It's like, I'm never getting off this bed. I'm going to die on this bed. If I have to pee, it's happening here because I am not getting out of bed after that. My auntie was so impressed with herself for, terrifying all of the grandchildren. But it was a great read, and it's things that I've come back to since then. And so it's kind of that fun to, I do like kind of that classic style, get into your head kind of thing. I do like suspense and some of that. I just, you start getting into the body horror and the gore, and we're done. I'm out. So coolness. So this leads us to we cannot have a Halloween episode without discussing monsters. Because we've talked a little bit about, a little bit more psychological horror and that kind of thing, but monsters are kind of the earmark of all things Halloween. We dress our kids up and let them go wandering the street. We touched a little bit on Frankenstein and Dracula. So, Miss CJ, what is your very favorite Halloween monster?
Oh, I like Jekyll and Hyde, even though I don't know if that, I mean, it is one of the classics, but this has fascinated me. This idea of being one person and then another. And when I was younger, for me, it was like first you're a monster, then you're not a monster, then you're, like to switch back and forth. Obviously, now as you get older, you're looking at kind of the theory behind it, which is, who you are deep inside and how that monster can come out. And so I like to play with those themes. But when I was younger, for me, it was just like, look at this individual transform into something completely different. How is this happening? And I'm terrified. And I loved it. I loved that idea. I also think I liked the idea of changing into something completely different. So even though this was a negative thing, I still thought, man, when I remember like having this thought, probably when I was 7, because I was just it was a little cartoon about it, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was thinking to myself, if he can change into something completely different, maybe I can become a mermaid. Like that was my thought process right there with the horror of Jekyll and Hyde, and then I'm like, I'd like to be the Little Mermaid. So that was where I went with that. But it has always stuck with me. I've always loved that particular, that particular monster. So
well, I'll take it, and then Dane, it's coming your way. So I like werewolves. I like the shifter thing, and it is kind of that same thing you were talking about of that dual nature and that very wild thing, and also who wouldn't want the gigantic puppy boyfriend thing? Yeah, you go to Twilight and things like that, and I'm not going to diss Twilight, but it's the whole, if you have to choose between guy whose body temperature is always whatever room temperature is,
right.
and fuzzy boyfriend,
we're going.
There's no question here. I get cold.
Particularly terrifying.
No,
but as far as snuggling goes, I can see your point. Yeah.
So I do like the shifters, and I am really amused by watching the different shifter types that have come up lately in both horror and paranormal romance, where it's like some of these are on the strange side.
Mm-hmm.
So I saw a cover for one recently that they shifted into a meerkat. And I'm thinking, I'm not entirely sure where that choice came from, because I'm not sure that I see shifter meerkat, but I love the creativity there. I love this idea of being able to, again, have those two things going on. And, is it something you fight? Is it something you embrace? There's so many different ways to come at it and say, what is the nature of this change? Is it you're all one thing, or is the shifter, the wolf personality, different than you are, and you have to work that out? So I find shifters fascinating. So, all right, Dane, it's up to you. What is your favorite Halloween scary monster, or not so scary?
Yeah, well, I've been trying to think while you guys have been talking. I mean, I do like werewolves as well. I think they're cool. I mean, I like wolves, which probably helps. But also I think, especially with monsters, quite often it's like the ones that it's like that old saying of what you don't see is like more scary than what you do see. And especially with like a lot of like older films, or even with newer films, when they go over the top with like CGI, things are really, really scary when they're off camera and you can't see them, and then you see them and you're like, oh, that's not scary, But the ones that popped into my head, so I quite like Slender Man, just from like the internet legends in the game and stuff. I think like that's quite a fun one and quite an easy costume to do as well, I think. And then also I saw the other day, actually, it was some cosplayers. They dressed up as from I don't know if you ever played Silent Hill, but there's a guy called Pyramid Head in that. He's got like a big metal pyramid on his head and a massive sword. And then he's got these like weird zombie nurse kind of things. And they dressed up as those, and it looks so cool. So I thought that was pretty good as well. But that, like, again, it's the pyramid head thing is creepy, but I think that's part of it is, again, the thing that you don't see. So he's got this big pyramid over his head, and you don't know what his face looks like. And that to me is kind of scarier than if you just had like you know, a scary face. So those are the ones that come to mind. But I mean, yeah, any outfit's pretty good. The other thing, again, talking about monsters, a friend of mine did an anthology, and they were asking for monster themed stories, and they said you can kind of interpret it how you want. And my take on that was, okay, we're just going to do a person, and we're going to do that take on it, that like sometimes the worst monsters are just people. And that's reminded me of everything that I've seen. People have just been posting saying this year's Halloween, it's going to be people dressing up as the people from Hocus Pocus, because the new Hocus Pocus came out.
Right.
It's going to be the Stranger Things thing with the T-shirt with the Hellfire Club. And it's going to be people dressing up as Jeffrey Dahmer. That's the three things that people are going to be doing this year. And again, like something like, I mean, the Jeffrey Dahmer, I quite like that. That's like, I don't know, there's something there. But also it is very insensitive as well. So, you know.
Yeah,
maybe like
kind of being cheeky in the whole thing.
Yeah, I was going to say maybe something like Jack the Ripper, but then nobody knows what he looked like. So, but then that gives you free reign. So you can basically just dress up as a Victorian gentleman, and then when people ask, you can say, yeah, I'm Jack the Ripper. They never caught me. Saucy Jack.
Nice. Oh, and see, that's fun, because the more we talk, the more different stories come up, and these things that you can think of, and that connection to video games, because the horror genre in video games is its very own thing. And I think that becomes even more interesting, because you're not only watching it, but you're really partaking in it.
Yeah.
And I remember the first, so this was way, way, way back when in college, the Resident Evil video games came out. And I was over at a friend's house, and the two of them started playing it, and I was done for the night, and I went home. So I get a call from them later, and it's like 4:00 in the morning, and they're like, we couldn't leave because we scared ourselves, and we had to play all the way to the end to see whether or not we survived, and now we're staying here. Because there's no way we can walk out to our cars or anything else. We're living here forever, because we have now played this game, and we have just riled ourselves up so much that it's not happening. But you think about that, and that visceral reaction that is, you're playing the game and things are happening to that character that you're driving around, and how that brings you right into the horror. And then you think about VR and things like that, and there's a place where my brain won't be going, because I don't think I could do a VR horror game without completely and utterly losing it. But it's fascinating.
It's funny, like, because I was thinking about Resident Evil earlier as well. But so I've just been playing. Actually, I've got I bought a Wii to relive my. That was when I was at like the equivalent of college, and we had Resident Evil 4 there, and it's great because you've got the Wii gun, so it's like playing like with an actual gun or whatever. But that's been ported to VR recently, and so you're walking around and like shooting the zombies, but it's all in VR. But unfortunately, because it's just a port of the original game. There are some bits that don't work quite so well. And one of them that springs into mind particularly, there are these monsters that are like these dudes with chainsaws. They have like a sack over their head and a chainsaw. And if you get your moves wrong, they literally chop your head off. And when you're playing the VR version, it just then cuts out to the wider thing, and you're just watching from the side as your head gets cut off. But I'm there like, imagine if they'd done it so that when your head gets cut off, you just see the ground rushing up towards your face. I think that would be brilliant.
That would be brilliant.
That's like nothing I ever would have thought of before, but you really you painted that picture nicely. Thanks, Dane.
I've sold it to you, yeah. Well, the other thing with Resident Evil, because they made the movies of that, probably it's got to be about 20 years ago now. And as you were saying earlier, when you were talking about like how zombies reflect the world we live in and whatnot, funnily, so with the first Resident Evil film, when I watched that, and again I was probably like 12, 13. And I watched that, and the zombies didn't scare me too much, because I was like, well, that's not going to actually happen. What did scare me was the homicidal computer that was killing everybody to stop the zombie virus from getting out. Because I was like, you could write a computer algorithm. You could do that today that would do that, and that would like cut off all the oxygen and like trapping people in lifts and all of this stuff to stop a bacteria from getting out. You could do that. That's realistic, and that terrified me more than the zombies did.
Yeah, there's always these real world aspects that creep into it that make you go, okay, wait. There are places where we might be really close to that, but I think that's also why we explore horror. So this was really going to be my next open question, was why do we like this? If we're sitting here going, yes, and this scares me and this freaks me out, and yet we go back to it. So what do you think drives people to go back to horror? Why do they want to read your books, Dane?
Well, there have been a few studies in it that show that like people actually do respond well to it. And I think it's like why people go on roller coasters. Like we know that we're going to be scared, but also we know that we're getting a thrill, and we know that it's like, you know, it's on a track where it's like a tested thing. We're going to be safe. So we know we're going to be safe, but we can put ourselves in that kind of uncomfortable position. And then obviously you get all the things like, you know, like the accelerated heartbeat and the endorphins rushing in and stuff as your body kind of tries to cope with it. And also, I think, I'm sure I've read before, like it tends to be people with like things like anxiety disorders actually tend to gravitate towards things like horror, because again, it's something that they can control. So you would think it would be the opposite, you know, but it's like what's the thing they do with like phobias when you like slowly introduce yourself?
Oh, yeah, so
graded
therapy.
exposure, I think.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's kind of like that. So again, it's putting you in a situation where like you're uncomfortable with it, sure, but you know straight away you're going to be fine. Like you're watching a film, you can pause it, you can put the book down or whatever, so you have that control over it. So I think there's a lot of that to it as well. And also, I mean, I don't know, I guess it's just a human thing, like you were saying, like people used to sit around campfires telling ghost stories. I'm sure that the same things that people are doing today at, you know, kids' summer camps, people were doing 2,000 years ago at a Roman army camp. You know, it's just a kind of a part of the human condition. So you might as well say, like, why do we like love stories, or why do we like fantasy or whatever? And it's like, well, it's just one of the things that we like. I guess the genres that we don't like don't exist because we don't like them, you know?
Yeah. Can't buy what doesn't exist because we don't like it. But it reminds me of a quote, and I had to just look it up so that I would make sure that I said it right. But there's a quote that says, "Fairy tales do not tell the children that dragons exist. Children already know that dragons exist. Fairy tales tell children that dragons can be killed."
Yeah.
And so I also wonder a little bit about that we go through the horror and we experience the thing because it tells us, you know, what comes out on the other side. And sometimes even when it doesn't always end well, you know, rocks fall, all die, we still end up with the journey has taught us something about how to defeat those things that scare us.
Yeah.
So I wonder if there's a little bit of that in there too.
I think so, and I know you talked about like romance, how romance will have like a happily ever after, and that happens surprisingly often in horror. Even if it's normally for a few reasons. One, it's to like contrast like the horror of what's happened. So you'll have like, you know, the final girl driving off in a dress covered in blood, but you know she's safe and the killer's been caught or whatever. Quite often they'll then subvert that as well, so that it'll look as though everything's okay. And then suddenly something will happen. This actually happened in that remake of the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Looks like everyone's survived. The bad guy's been vanquished. And then literally the last scene of the movie, it just sweeps the rug back out from under your feet. So I think that's interesting. But also just talking about how when it doesn't end up happily, that has reminded me, probably actually my favorite horror film is The Mist. And it's based on a Stephen King novella, and I only recently read the novella. The novella ends differently to the movie does. The movie has the darkest ending of anything I've ever seen ever.
Oh, wow.
It's great, and that's why I love it. Like the actual 90% of the film isn't that good, but then the ending is just, it's like a punch in the gut. And so just kudos to that. And also, again, you can't, that's the funny thing, is like that's the directors who did that. That wasn't Stephen King who came up with that ending. He had his typical Stephen King problem of not really having an ending at all. It just kind of petered out in the original. And then in the movie, it's genius. It's genius. It's evil genius, but it is genius.
But it is genius. Oh, fantastic. Well, I think we've been talking close to our hour and having a really good time, and we could definitely go on much longer. So, Dane, we will have to have you back when we talk about mysteries and talk about cozy mysteries and Sherlock Holmes, because I'm sure that we've got those coming up, because we've had a really good time. So one of the last things that we do here on the Publishing by the Numbers podcast is we have a moment of irrelevancy, wherein we may share anything that we want as long as it is utterly irrelevant to what we've been talking about. So now that I've defined what it is, I'm going to let CJ go first, so you have a moment to think about what is something entirely irrelevant that you would love to share with the listening audience. And as part of yours, please share with us, where can people find your books? Where can they find you so that they can go and read these things and be horrified and love every minute of it? So CJ, what is your moment of irrelevancy?
So my moment of irrelevancy has to do with math homework. why is fourth grade math so different from the fourth grade math I remember? It's like that Incredibles moment where it's like math is math. This is psychotic. And yet no one is doing division like I taught, like I was, taught division. It's all of this 50 million steps to get where you want to go. And we're going to show you 5 other ways in which to do the very same thing to get to the same thing. And I'm like, I don't like it. That's all. So that's all. More of a griping irrelevant moment than anything else. And now I'm done.
Dane, something totally irrelevant, and where can we find you going forward?
Well, the thing that springs to mind, because I've got my little scissors here ready, my cat has got all these little clumps in him, and he's got this little bald patch now, and so I keep being really mean to him and making bald jokes to my cat because I've trimmed off part of his fur, and I don't think he appreciates it, but it makes me laugh a lot. So that's what I've got for you. And what am I saying? Where you can find me?
Yes, where we can find you and where we can find your books.
Yeah, so you can just Google my name, Dane Cobain, Dane, and then surname Cobain. That's my handle on most social networking things. Somebody stole it on TikTok though, and it's not even their name. So I'm like, why are you using my name for your TikTok? And on Facebook, I'm Dane Cobain Music because that was what it started as, a music page, and I never got around to updating it. DaneCobain.com. Books are on Amazon, and come say hello. I don't bite.
Fantastic. We will make sure all of that goes in the show notes so that people can locate you and buy lots of books for Halloween. My completely irrelevant moment is not entirely irrelevant, but it's mostly because it's not about the show. But we're going to carve pumpkins. We have many of them. My daughter and my other daughter went to the local pumpkin patch, and I swear those two, I send them and it's like, go get a pumpkin. And they always come back with somewhere between 4 and 8 pumpkins. And it's like, we don't need all of these. And they're like, yes, we do, because we have all these ideas. So we have to start looking at, when are we going to do the pumpkin carving, and are we going to carve or not? Because if you carve, then their lifespan is shorter. So you can't do that until almost Halloween. But if you like paint them or do other things, all of which they have done, then we could do those now and they can sit out on the porch. So my relevancy is that we're going to deal with pumpkins, and then on Sunday I am making a pumpkin cake, which is my very, very favorite. Well, carrot cake and pumpkin cake, right up there, neck and neck on my favorite cakes.
It makes me want to come visit you so badly. I would come anyway, but for the food, definitely. You know me.
Oh yeah, come on over. I have an open door, open kitchen policy. So, alrighty then. Well, thanks everybody for joining us. You can find the show and the show notes at www.atlantumdigital.com, and you can follow the podcast on YouTube or your favorite podcast distributor. If you enjoyed the show, please subscribe and leave us a review. We'll see y'all later, guys. Bye-bye.
Bye, guys.
Bye-bye.